ISBA in the development of a brand new set of standards on how to audit and verify sustainability information by companies, which I think is essential for the credibility of the system. A key remaining element of the disclosure puzzle is the role of transition plans, because we must ensure reliable, forward-looking information and not just photographs of the past. So in IOSCO, we are starting work on transition plans in order to monitor emerging practices in the formulation and use of transition plans by corporate issuers, with a view to assessing the risks of greenwashing, and we will engage, of course, also with asset managers on how they go about their own transition plans. Beyond disclosures, the sustainable finance ecosystem has grown very quickly, as you know. We have had an increase in sustainable themed bonds. We have had a big increase in investment funds with sustainability in their name or in their characteristics. But preferences of investors are changing very slowly. If you look at recent polls among asset managers, 90% of them globally, worldwide, they say sustainability is a factor in their asset allocation decisions. Only 17% of them say it is a critical factor, meaning it is really relevant in how they allocate their investments. And if you look at the United States, that figure goes to 5%. So the terrain we have to cover is immense. And if you look at it from the European perspective, around 40% of the assets under management by UCITS, by investment funds in Europe, are branded sustainable, Article 8, etc. But when you ask investors, retail investors, whether they have sustainability preferences, only between 10 and 25% of them declare that sustainability is important for their own portfolios. I'm talking about the origin of those funds. So with all these products, green products, the risk of greenwashing is also, is precisely because of that is much very high. So we've done a lot of work from the IOSCO perspective on this area too. We published in 2021 recommendations for ESG rating producers, rating agencies and data providers, and also for asset managers on how to avoid greenwashing. And finally, we looked into market structures, and here carbon markets play a very prominent role. So we have published in July of this year a report with recommendations on how to improve compliance carbon markets, those based on cap and trade systems. And more importantly, on the voluntary carbon market side, we will be announcing tomorrow our consultation on a set of 21 recommendations on how to improve integrity on voluntary carbon markets, which is a more nascent market, much smaller market. And this will be presented at the Spanish pavilion in the Blue Zone at 1 p.m., so you're all invited to be there also if you want. So I conclude by saying that clearly the role of finance and financial regulation is absolutely essential on this matter. We have, I think, laid out internationally and especially at European level, no doubt, the essential components of the regulatory framework for this to work, but we need to have real changes in the preferences of investors, which will ultimately drive the whole process, and we need to have, of course, the most important part, public policies that incentivize decarbonization. Because without these, financial markets will just be catalysts and intermediaries, and we will not get the chemical reaction that we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Thank you for giving us that sort of wider view there of the work of the IOSCO, but also the insight into what investors are thinking. And I think that's something we'll come back to with the panel a little bit in a moment. So, well, here we are with the panel. Let me introduce them to you all. Maybe starting from the end there. Very happy to have you, Amin Belhaj Solami, who is the CEO for Middle East and Africa of BN Paribas. So great to have you with us. Alina Reuner is the Director for Operations Support and Climate. That's the key word, at the European Investment Bank. We also have Andrew McDougall, who is a partner at PwC for Strategy and Business, based in Luxembourg. And Nuria Rodriguez, Director for Corporate and Social Responsibility at Naturgy. So thanks all of you for joining us. Jean-Christophe and Rodrigo gave us some really useful scene setting there. I think the key words also being around incentivizing what we need to do. And so I'd like to start by kind of homing in on the positives. Maybe with you, Andrew, to start with, to sort of help us from your perspective to answer, how financial institutions can leverage those opportunities, and undoubtedly there are, presented by sustainable regulation, including transparency and disclosure, to actually enhance your sustainable activities.
Well, thanks, Sharon, and thank you for the invitation today. And as well as being a partner in PwC, I'm a former colleague from the IB. So yes. Great to see so many old friends and you. Let me, if I might, just pick up on directly from Rodrigo's presentation, and maybe add a nuance, if you don't mind, Rodrigo, because I think it's a fundamentally important question as to whether sustainable finance regulation is really having an impact on asset allocation and ultimately is delivering on the goals of the EU Green Deal to orient capital towards sustainability. And I have to believe it cannot be a pure coincidence that with the emergence of the sustainable finance regulatory framework, that the gap between the cost of capital for sustainable activities, say clean energy, and non-sustainable activities has widened quite dramatically in that period. Now that may not just be because of the disclosure regulations, but I have to believe it's had a role in pushing asset allocation away from dirty industries towards clean industries. Goldman Sachs estimated recently that the premium, if you like, or the penalty in the cost of capital for, say, oil and gas compared to clean energy was 3 times. At its peak in about 2020-21, it's about a 30% cost of capital for oil and gas for new projects and about 10% for clean energy. Now, when you think about the impact of that on where capital goes, and the hurdle rate that investors now have for oil and gas projects compared to clean energy projects, it's quite substantial. Now that has come down a little bit over the last 12, 18 months, particularly because of Ukraine. More capital has gone into oil and gas. But nonetheless, when you think about the impact of that, it's the equivalent of a carbon price of about 70 euros a tonne. That difference in the cost of capital in terms of the bankability of those projects. Now again, I don't claim it's entirely as a result of the disclosure regulations by themselves. It's also forward-looking expectations by investors as to what's going to happen in carbon markets, carbon pricing, regulation. But you have to believe the disclosures themselves have had some impact on that. And we see it in Europe in particular with SFDR. We see a huge migration in assets away from what are called Article 6 funds under SFDR, which basically means no sustainability factors really taken into account in the asset allocation, towards Article 8 and Article 9 now, where the vast majority of funds are. And even within Article 8, and this getting a little bit techie in a sense, there's different types of investment strategies. There's a migration away from Article 8 investment strategies that just take into account ESG factors, which can mean anything really, and in terms of, we think about it sometimes, towards Article 8 funds that say they actually target sustainable investment assets in their asset allocation strategy. We see this migration in asset allocation. We see the change in the cost of capital for clean versus dirty. And I believe that is ultimately the purpose of these regulations. Now,
But you can't quite say that they are what is driving this. I mean, what concrete opportunities do you think those regulations offer? I mean, is it also the roadmap? Is it a clear roadmap? Are they clear enough?
Well, so what investors will tell you, and it's very interesting, about notwithstanding a lot of the problems with the sustainable finance agenda in terms of implementation,
Yeah.
And we know, and Jean-Christophe has spoken about the usability issues of the taxonomy.
Yeah. And we'll come back to those in a minute.
And we know in some ways Europe got the sequencing wrong in all of this. They started with SFDR, then they went on to the taxonomy, then now they're moving on to CSRD. So ultimately the investees are only disclosing after the financial intermediaries. For any other region of the world, do it the other way around. Start with the investees and then work on to the financial sector. But what's interesting about it is the financial community still say it's the right thing to do. Notwithstanding the complaints they have about the details of SFDR and the confusion over Article 8, the usability issues of DNHS in the taxonomy, they still say this is the right thing to do. Why? Yeah. Because it protects them, one, from greenwashing, from accusations that they are making it up as they go along. That's the last thing most financial institutions want to be in. So they want to have a framework. And secondly, they want a common framework. They want a level playing field between all participants so that when they disclose on the same basis using the same frameworks. So notwithstanding all the problems, the financial sector wants those problems fixed, yes, but they want the principles of this to continue.
Exactly, and that's a really important point, and I think one that Jean-Christophe reflected as well, that the principle is not disputed, it's how we put it into practice, how we get it right. Let me turn to the industrial perspective, if I could, Nuria, from Naturgy. Give us a sense of on the ground, what opportunities, what challenges you are facing in terms of the sustainable finance regulations. Maybe also picking in the EU taxonomy a little, what that actually means for your company in practice.
Okay, thank you. First of all, for those that don't know Naturgy, Naturgy is a multi-utility company. We have 20 million customers around the world, mainly Latin America, Spain, Australia, US. And we have 180 years of history. So what are our challenges of this energy transition? Of course, it's not the first energy transition we've lived. Won't be maybe the last one. But this one has a very characteristic, is that we have to do it very fast. We have to accelerate energy transition to reach net zero by 2050. So the challenges we are facing are three at the same time, which is called the energy trilemma. First of all, we have to assure security of supply, because we are not, don't want to face energy cutting, so we have to assure security of supply. Secondly, we have to do it at the same time by reaching net zero, by reaching nature positive, so an environment perspective. And thirdly, and not the last one, people. What do we do about just transition? Those people that are affected because of the closing down of energies, of fossil fuel energies, or what do we do about affordable prices of energy? So this trilemma are the challenges that we have to face all together in the same time. And they have to be balanced at the same time. So for these challenges, I think we have three levers that are interconnected. We cannot see in a standalone, but they are absolutely interconnected. One is regulation, energy policymakers, sustainability in finance. Secondly, financing is a key element for these challenges. And thirdly, technology. So these three levers, these three catalysts have to work and be an ecosystem. It's not only one regulation, it's not only one tool, financing tool, or one technology, but they have to be all at once working to reach the same path that we have to acknowledge. So in this sense, for us, for example, in taxonomy speaking, I think it was a very needed regulation in order to speak the same language, not only for investors, but also for companies.
Indeed.
this is the third year that we are disclosing the information in taxonomy. Of course, there have been a lot of adjustments that have to be made because we had a lack of data that was needed, maybe some criteria that wasn't clear enough. So I think we are living the normal situation of a new regulation, which is, to adjust all our mechanisms in order to give a very transparent information as the European community wants. And in this sense, Security Markets Commission is a very key element for these adjustments and clarifications that have to be done during implementing the taxonomy regulation. And I think, of course, it's a key element in order to give transparency, but it's not the only thing we need. Of course, carbon prices were absolutely key in the energy transition and the reduction of CO2 emissions. ETS, for example, it's a very good example of how CO2 emissions reduce in the European Union. So I think it's an ecosystem of regulations that have to work all together in order to foster and embrace technologies that can reach net zero emissions by 2050.
Thank you very much, Nuria, for that. And I want to come back to you in a minute just to pick up on your point about the social aspect of this and the transition too, which Rodrigo mentioned as well. It's not just about defining what is green now, but what will be green and how it can become green, and that involves the social aspect too. But first, let me turn to you, Amin Soulami from BNP Paribas. Maybe broadening out a bit from Europe, I'd like to ask you to what extent for the region for which you cover, the Middle East and Africa as well, is the sustainable finance regulation adequately reflecting the kind of challenges that you are encountering? And how would you like to see the evolution of that regulation to kind of take into account the way the market is changing and the emerging challenges? That's a long question, but I'm sure you can you can handle it. Thank you.
It's a very, very broad,
very broad
question.
Yes.
Yes. So I think first of all, the region has over 70 regulators themselves looking at this topic, and it's fast moving and implementing its own regulation. By the way, looking a lot at Europe, which is leading the way on those topics. And those topics cannot be purely locally treated. They have to be looked at on a global basis, even if each country will have their own priorities. Mm-hmm. I think everybody also realized the need to have interoperability, exactly. And something that Rodriguez said earlier. From an investor's point of view, you need to be able to compare apple to apple. So adding new regulations and creating even more differences is not really the way to go. I think, of course, you will have some elements of specificity which are evolving and that will appear, but there is also a need, and that's more broadly, to have interoperability of those regulations. And when you look, for instance, at taxonomy, or you look at disclosures, these are aspects of the regulation that come into play when you are actually a practitioner, but they do not answer all the questions. They are very important, for instance, in looking at avoiding greenwashing. That's one aspect, but it doesn't answer all the questions that you need to answer when you want to actually use this as a catalyst to finance more low carbon transition projects. A lot of those, in order to actually be viable, need to be, first of all, economically profitable. And that's, of course, you have the data and you have the nature of what you're doing, but you also have the financial aspects, the financial incentives or disincentives that are very important to make them viable or not. Today, we are still suffering from a lack of viable, economically, projects to finance.
Right.
So yes, we have to be very careful about how things are structured and give the investors the ability to compare and make a choice between their alternatives. But further than that, we need to create more of those opportunities. And to create more of those opportunities, it's a little bit outside of the direct regulation on climate, but more probably something that governments need to put the right incentives in place to actually have that catalyst role to generate more of those opportunities. We as a bank, for instance, we are here to intermediate and participate in some of this financing, but only when it makes sense from a financial point of view. So, see, there's a lot to unpack in this. I'm sure we'll discuss more in your follow-up questions.
Let me just ask you before I turn to Elena. I just want to pick up on a point you said that you see Europe as a model for other regions. So, despite the teething troubles that we've mentioned already, for example, with the taxonomy, is it the case then that others in other regions are looking to Europe to provide that model in terms of not just the taxonomy, but other financial regulations concerning?
Not sure I would say it's a model. It's leading. I think it's ahead of the pack. I think maybe it has not been done in the perfect way already, so we would not say that.
So we could learn some lessons and do it a bit
you learn
differently.
some lessons, and I think for those that are coming now in play, they can benefit from avoiding those mistakes that have been done and go faster.
Yeah, we'll come back on what we think those mistakes are and what we can do differently. But Elena, maybe I can turn to you. So I think most people know in the room anyway, but perhaps those joining online don't, that the EIB has shown a huge increase in the share of climate finance within its own business, well over 50%. I'll let you explain that. But what do you think have been the main drivers since the EIB set up its Climate Bank roadmap and made all these very big ambitions? And do you think that some of those drivers have related to regulation as well?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon, for the question. And for my part, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I tried to indeed frame my answer with the topic that we are discussing today, the sustainable finance regulation. So first, I would like to maybe make 3 points. First of all, when we announced our climate ambition in 2019, it was done at the back of the European Green Deal and indeed the emerging sustainable finance regulation. So it provided the frame for us from the start. And when we then started to consider how do we operationalize this ambition, we draw ourselves the so-called Climate Bank roadmap. That is a multifaceted document that provides the guide rails for our business development, but also the policy steer. How to get to those targets, namely the minimum 50% of green finance by 2025, alignment with the Paris goals, as well as us supporting 1 trillion of investment over the green investment over the critical decade. So the policy frame indeed is inspired and motivated by the EU regulatory framework, namely and notably the emerging EU taxonomy, the non-financial reporting framework, as well as also I would like to mention the climate risk related considerations and EBA as well as ECB guidelines. Our Paris alignment framework again draws from the taxonomy and in particular from the do no significant harm principle, but also promotes disclosure as well as companies reporting and setting plausible, motivated decarbonization targets again motivated and emulating the emerging regulation. So that's about the policy frame that we have set up and how it links to the sustainable finance regulation. But it's not, of course, only about regulation and constraints, but it's also about business development. And while I think the regulation and our own policy frame does not really explain our achievements so far, it has provided us a transparent frame to orientate our business. And the previous speakers have spoken a lot about the need of visible direction of travel, transparency, the level playing field. And I think with us, with the CBR policy frame, we have created that also for the frontline teams. They are engaging with the taxonomy, with our Paris alignment framework, with our reporting framework, and can actually have meaningful conversations about these issues with our clients, and also then see what are the areas, sectors, and industries that we might want to address and support in order to get to our targets. I think the policy frame also provides then guidance for product development for us. So to conclude, I think as we are now at the midpoint of our implementation of the CBR, that we still consider to be fit for purpose, I think on reflection, the EU regulatory frame that we have then translated to on our policies has indeed provided that transparency, that predictability for us to drive our own environment or the green transition, and indeed increase our contribution to green finance. And I think here I would like to conclude by saying it is about transparency. And I like to use the sentence or the notion that what gets reported often gets managed. And I think that has also and brought to the core of the business strategy, gets mainstreamed. And I think that's exactly what has happened in the EIB. The policy frame, transparent policy frame, criteria, including the engagement with the EU taxonomy and the emerging reporting requirements have exactly done that for us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. As you say, it's really center stage in the internal discussions. Andrew, coming back to also a point I think Rodrigo made earlier in his opening statement, he painted that picture of something of a disconnect between the investors' sort of attitudes, what they're actually doing, what they're thinking. And you're obviously engaging a lot with investors at PwC, but I want to also ask you about the EU taxonomy, which of course is only one part of the puzzle, but it's a controversial one too. To what extent are the investors that you're talking to implementing the EU taxonomy? Give us a picture of what that looks like and how they're implementing it into their investment strategies.
So I mean, I think we'll start to see, some of the disclosures from banks next year onto the taxonomy regulation, and I think what we'll see is a little bit of disappointment, and I think the Commission are bracing themselves for that from the banking sector in particular. I think to taxonomy alignment that'll be reported both under the taxonomy regulation and to the EBA in terms of the green asset ratio. Our sense is it's going to be pretty low.
Right.
Probably we're talking single digits, of taxonomy alignment at
in
most.
terms of who can say they are EU taxonomy aligned, according to the strictest
in terms of banks
criteria.
reporting how much of their assets are taxonomy aligned, so how much of their loans under various asset classes that are covered under the taxonomy regulation to various sectors. But look, it's a journey, and this is, and everybody recognizes this is just going to be the start. I think asset managers will probably have a slightly higher reported taxonomy alignment. They've been more banks are very cautious in how they use the taxonomy and how they report it. Asset managers are a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more aggressive in terms of using proxies and estimates for taxonomy alignment. I think what we'll begin to see going forward, there's been a little bit of frustration, I suppose, among investors that so far it's kind of black and white. You know, you either invest in green or it's not green, and it's very binary. It's very black and white, and a lot of focus initially in product design on are the assets sustainable or are they not, including in accordance with the taxonomy. I think what we're beginning to see, as the data improves, it'll become probably more popular among investors, is a little bit more nuance and a little bit more focus on transition.
Yes.
And improver strategies. And I think this is also enabled ultimately by taxonomy disclosure, the increasing taxonomy alignment disclosures that will come under CSRD in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Because what we'll begin to see, I mean, there's always been an interest in transition. The difficulty for transition investment at the moment is any company can put out a good press release saying, we're heading towards net zero, we want to be in transition. And it's very difficult for investors to really distinguish between the quality of those transition plans. What taxonomy and CSRD will enable is ultimately investors to transparently compare taxonomy-aligned CapEx against taxonomy-aligned revenues. And it really is a very, very visible ratio. Even if your revenues are not already taxonomy-aligned, so you're not already in a lot of taxonomy-aligned businesses and sustainable businesses, that's okay, as long as your CapEx is taxonomy-aligned. And if you have a large program of CapEx towards taxonomy-aligned activities, the ratio between that and your existing taxonomy-aligned revenues is going to become extremely interesting to investors. And I really think we're going to see more and more capital allocated to investment plans that allow companies to say, look, we're not already green, but we really are going to become green. And you can look at it in the data and our disclosures under CSRD. And I think that's the direction of travel.
That's very interesting. I mean, maybe you have something to respond to on that. And particularly, maybe you can tell us a bit in this context about BNP Paribas' low carbon transition group and the way in which you're actually accompanying your customers along that path to carbon neutrality, which is all about the transition that Andrew is talking about.
Exactly, and it was, as I was listening to you, Andrew, it was exactly what we are doing, actually. We have set up this low carbon transition group last year, and it's comprised now of 200 professionals, bankers, 100 senior bankers, 100 experts. And the approach we're taking is exactly along the line that you described, because if we were to only finance the green, it's very little, and we believe very strongly it's in our strategy that we want to accompany our clients that have a serious transition plan. In fact, we are looking at 3 categories of clients. We have the existing clients that have a serious transition plan and for whom we accompany them in financing their transition projects. And those are established clients. We have a second category of, I would say, like the new innovators. So there we are looking at new clients that are starting maybe new technologies that are the clients of the future, which today are very small, and for which it's a different type of service that we can bring, but they are clearly in the future. And the third ones are the investors that are going to invest in those projects, and we can bridge between all of them. So for that we have also categorized the different level of maturity of the types of technologies that exist. So for instance, you have the EV, which is today very mature. You have the green hydrogen, which is in the middle. And you have, let's say, SMRs, which are still in development. And for each of those categories of clients, we have specific services that we can bring. For the mature one, we can provide financing, we can provide advisory, we can provide the whole gamut of products. For the ones in the middle, it's more around advisory. And for the one at the bottom, it's more equity introducing to investors. But all of that in a very structured way with specialized bankers, and all of that resting very strongly on structured data that we need to have. But all of this is done internally, obviously informed by all the regulatory requirements that we have, because also we have to disclose everything that we do for those clients. But we're doing it our way, exactly in that direction, which is, if we only do the dark green and that's it, we're not going to go very far. And a lot of the opportunity is in reducing the brown and going in the direction of the green.
Absolutely. Maybe, Alina, you want to come here briefly, and then I'll go to Nuria. I mean, to what extent, the EIB's journey in terms of its transformation is also a journey with the clients as well, isn't it? So do you see in this transition part of it opportunities, challenges, particularly when it comes to the hard-to-abate sectors, which I think the EIB has identified as being a real key area for work?
Yes, maybe again, sort of 3 points. I think our own policy framework is very ambitious and indeed aims to integrate the taxonomy and how we then track and report on green. But it does not mean that we only want to support those that are already there. We want to indeed engage and support those who need to transition, including the hard-to-abate sectors, but who are serious and willing to transition. And I spoke a bit about our Paris alignment approach, where indeed we require the companies, first of all, at the investment level, to invest in sustainable Paris-aligned assets, meaning that these assets are not doing significant harm to the taxonomy objectives. That's how we have set our frame. But we require at the corporate level at the same time, which is a new approach for the bank. We were the first ones, the Dale players, if you will, to develop a Paris alignment framework for the corporates or that touch upon the corporate level activities, where we say we want to see you to disclose credible decarbonization plans. You may not yet be able, as a company or as an industry, to set 1.0 degree compatible plans. But the plans need to be ambitious. They need to demonstrate a medium-term target that you are able to justify, as well as elaborate on the longer-term net zero pathway. And this also, takes inspiration again from the emerging financial sustainable finance regulation. So what I'm trying to say here, and maybe to conclude, indeed, is that it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. We need to accompany our clients in this journey. We are also not only providing financing but also advisory, how to draw up these plans. And while we want to see that the investments are sustainable, we in particular want to see that with those we engage, they are having a credible pathway towards that net zero future.
And you say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, which of course is true. Having said that, it is an urgent challenge. And that's the challenge as well for all of the financial institutions and the companies and everyone involved in this, is to get the right regulations in place and to then be able to implement them quite quickly with clients on board. But of course, it's not just clients on board, it's people, it's social, it's communities. I mean, we live in democratic societies where if we don't bring communities along with us, we're not going to get there either. That's where, Nuria, I want to ask you, in terms of that social dimension to the transition, how are you, but also generally companies that you're in touch with, how are you integrating that social dimension into it. How important is it in your view?
Absolutely, yes. Social can be really a barrier in order to reach this transition with the rhythm that we need. I will give you a very good example of these three dimensions that have to be very balanced, no? And it's in our case, in 2018, our shareholders decided to close down all our coal plants. Coal plants that were profitable at that moment, so, but of course, compared to renewables and the transition we wanted to make, they were not compatible with this period. In order to deliver these closing downs, it was very critical to sign an agreement with institutions, with unions, with local communities, and company, of course. In our case, there were other multi-utility companies in Spain. And so in these just transition agreements, we covered all the levers that we wanted to, of course, to cover in the transition. One was, of course, the closing down in a secure way. It means assuring that no problems of security of supply were arising after that. Of course, the dismantling itself, it was made in a secure way, but also, and very important, how do we re-skill the people that were affected because of this activity that was closed down? What other activities could we offer them in order to give employment to these people that were living in those areas, normally rural areas, where they lost their jobs because of the closing down? And so we work a lot with unions and the companies itself in order to give them other alternatives. In our case, fostering energy, renewable energies development in those facilities that we had these coal plants. So we give them an alternative, but also we help them to re-skill the people in order to, to learn how to deal and operate, for example, wind, solar plants, or renewable gases, etc. In this process, it was also very important financing. Related to next-gen funds, we presented several projects in hydrogen, renewable energies, in order to give to these areas another green energy transition. So in this process, public and private sector cooperation was very, very key element. And in this case, we see a toolkit of elements that help this energy transition in those facilities in order to reduce our emissions, and also, in our case, to restore the placements where these coal plants were operating by that time. So I think it's a very good example of how we can drive energy transition in an ordered way, in a rationalist way, where all the elements needed were absolutely balanced and coordinated. Employment, financing, secure supply, public and private sector cooperation. So all those elements were key factors for being successful in these transition actions that we made in those in that case. So it's a very good example for other actions that we are driving. For example, in renewals, we are facing also people that complain about well, it's the typical thing, no? Not in my backyard, no? I want renewals, but not in my village or not in my area. So we have to work a lot with social communities in order to involve them from the beginning in these projects, so we can, implement projects that it's a win-win for all parts.
And of course, there's room for a kind of softer kind of regulation, of course, as well, where the European Union has the just transition approach. Also, out of Europe, the just energy transition partnerships but clearly it's on the ground with companies, with communities, that the work is going to have to be done. So thank you very much for that important kind of demonstration, and clearly we need models like that. I want to just turn to the audience. In case any of you have a question you would like to ask from our audience, please let me know. I will give you the microphone. If not, I will maybe finish the panel with one question for all of you, which I could invite you to answer briefly, which concerns really going back to our starting point in a way, the issue of sustainable finance regulation. I mean, if you could just sort of identify one or at the most two actions, but more on the innovative or technological side, where you think we could better support the effective integration. Also the monitoring, I mean, that's something we haven't necessarily talked about as well, of the regulations in order to put them into practice. Bearing in mind, just to go back to the point I made earlier, we don't have the luxury of, you know, many working groups and, you know, time to talk like this panel too much. So maybe I'll start with Amin, if you could identify maybe something you would like to see.
Difficult question.
I'll give you a moment to think about it if you want.
Yes, let me
and
think.
ask Andrew, go for it first.
Oh, well, look, I mean, I think so far, and everybody's learning how to do it, there is a significant compliance cost associated with the sustainable finance disclosure regime. You know, that certainly that's being built up in Europe. And I think that's one of the things the rest of the world is looking at, going, you know, it looks very complex and expensive. Do we want to impose that burden of data collection and reporting on our economy? And even in Europe, you saw 6 months ago the Commission pulling back a little bit under CSRD, saying, look, we'll have a materiality assessment on the topics that you have to disclose against. So you don't have to disclose against everything, only the things that are actually material from an impact or risk perspective. I think hopefully, if you know, if I look into the future and be optimistic, maybe we can connect, you know, technology, AI in particular, with the data requirements for disclosure and significantly reduce the cost of these disclosure and reporting obligations in a way that makes it much more usable, not just for SMEs in Europe, but also for the rest of the world, in a, you know, which has got a, perhaps in some ways, a more challenging data environment than Europe.
Alina, a thought? I mean, Christoph also talked about usability and data issues.
Yes, like many others, we are also scribbling with the data issues. And indeed, I think if I had to name two things, one is indeed that we need to become more data-centric and more, in a smart way, utilize the emerging technologies, just like AI, in that data collection, and then developing harmonized typologies and taxonomies, so that we can, as an ecosystem, indeed progress on transparency and reporting. So I think technology will certainly help us to lower some of those barriers that we currently have with the usability and applicability. Another point I would like to mention, which is not maybe related to technology per se, but I think Jean-Christos alluded to that we need smart regulation and not ill-conceived regulation that potentially would hamper actually the redirection of capital flows to green. And I think there partnerships are important. So partnerships between the regulators and the industry, closer communication and collaboration there, so that it's not the journey that we maybe have seen a bit, is that you first comes the regulation, and then the industry starts wondering and coming to terms with it, trying to translate and apply in practice. I think the two processes should go hand in hand. And as some wise person said, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And I think there is some truth in that also when we now consider future regulatory development of the future regulatory framework.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
yeah, no, it's an African proverb, I think. If you want, it's one of those that I use. No, now that I had a little bit of time to think, I think what I would suggest is there is already a lot of thought around regulation. So maybe it's not the time to add more, but more to regroup and to see how it can be used better, especially linking with practitioners, because there are not so many practitioners, in fact. And I think going back to your point, just making a pause and looking at how to make it really work with what we have rather than adding more could be a good way forward.
Absolutely. And maybe I'm going to give the final word to one of those practitioners from industry. What do you think you need more of or less of, from the regulators or the policymakers?
Yeah. First of all, I would say we want neutral technology, be neutral technology. The target is to have technologies which are decarbonized. So having said that, regulation should be neutral according to the technologies that are available in this sense, as soon as they reach, as they are decarbonized. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we need more agile regulations in order to permitting. Permitting is an issue sometimes. Secondly, of course, we need to adapt a period of adaptation in those disclosures. Data and systems have to be adapted to the new disclosures. And here, as before, my colleagues were saying, CapEx now for taxonomy is one of the key elements that we should see, if the company is doing their homework or not. So, neutrality, agile regulation in order to accompany the development of green technologies, and secondly, to have time, to adapt and adjust our IT.
Thank you so much. This has been a very rich discussion, really fascinating. I hope the audience in the room and online have enjoyed it as much as we have. I'd like to say thanks once again to the panelists, to Andrew McDowell from PwC, Nuria Rodriguez from Naturgy, Amin Belhaj Sulami from BNP Paribas, and to Elena Reuner from the EIB. And thanks to also Rodrigo and Jean-Christophe for opening our panel earlier, and wish you a very good day and good speed ahead. Bye.